The air was heavy with the quiet hum of crickets along the lakefront, a peaceful morning broken only by the sound of footsteps on the wooden deck. The cabin office, tucked away between towering pines, was supposed to be a sanctuary of calm, a place where business met tranquility. But that morning, peace was shattered. Without warning, the door slammed open, and in barged the one person everyone in the community had come to fear, the HOA's self-appointed enforcer. She stormed inside with fury, her eyes scanning the room, ready to unleash her authority. Yet, in an instant, her bravado drained, her face stiffened, and silence swallowed her voice. The cabin office had once been nothing more than an old lakeside retreat, a small wooden structure that stood quietly at the water's edge. For decades, it had been a place where families came to fish, camp, and build memories. But for Marcus Johnson, a successful African-American entrepreneur who had recently moved to the area, it was more than a cabin, it was a statement. He had purchased the lake property not only as a personal refuge, but also as a place to conduct his work, a retreat where he could balance life between nature and leadership. The community surrounding the lake was beautiful, yet divided. On one side were longtime residents who valued tradition, peace, and inclusivity. On the other side were the HOA loyalists, residents who hid prejudice beneath the cover of rules and standards. Among them, one woman stood out. She had earned herself a reputation, not by kindness, but by control. She was relentless, particularly when dealing with anyone who didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should look like. And Marcus, with his growing influence and his decision to host important figures at his property, was a constant target. Neighbors often whispered about how far she would go. Some said she lived for confrontation, patrolling the community as if she were the law itself. She masked her racism with policy, cloaking it in claims of protecting property values and upholding the community's standards. But for Marcus, the hostility wasn't just personal, it was systemic, echoing the struggles he had faced in boardrooms, contracts, and institutions throughout his career. What no one in the HOA could have predicted, however, was that this quiet lake cabin, the place they dismissed as an outsider's retreat, would soon become the stage for a confrontation that would ripple far beyond the water's edge. Marcus had grown accustomed to subtle resistance in many forms, but here, at the lake, it wasn't subtle at all. Each week seemed to bring another. Letter from the HOA. His cabin's deck railing was too rustic, his boat not properly registered, his guests exceeding the community visitor limit. The notices stacked higher, dripping with condescension, each one signed by the same name, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. She never once approached with kindness, never once spoke as a neighbor. Instead, she carried herself, as though she were judge and executioner, determined to prove that Marcus did not belong. The whispers began too. Some neighbors stopped waving when he passed by, muttering about too much traffic near his cabin, though no one seemed to complain when others hosted gatherings. The double standards were glaring, but the weight of history made them familiar. Marcus remembered his father's stories of being questioned in spaces he had every right to occupy, of being followed in stores where his money spent the same as anyone else's. It was the same song, only now sung with new lyrics, rules, codes, and regulations. Things escalated the morning of the incident. Marcus had arranged a quiet meeting at the cabin with several state officials and the governor himself, a private discussion about expanding opportunities for minority-owned businesses across the region. For Marcus, it was more than business. It was legacy. A chance to create doors that others like him would one day walk through. He had prepared everything with care, the cabin polished, documents in order, and a table set by the wide window overlooking the lake. But while he worked, the HOA enforcer had been watching. She saw the cars pull in, black SUVs, unfamiliar faces, official-looking suits. To her, it wasn't a moment of pride for the community. It was a threat to her sense of control. She didn't see progress or leadership. She saw an opportunity to humiliate, to prove her dominance over someone she had decided was an intruder in her neighborhood. Storming up the path, she rehearsed her grievances in her mind. Maybe it would be about noise, maybe about parking. Maybe she'd claim he was violating the HOA's guidelines by turning his cabin into an office space. It didn't matter what the excuse was. What mattered was asserting herself. Making sure Marcus felt small, unwanted, and out of place. Marcus inside felt the shift before it even happened. Years of experience had given him an instinct for confrontation, that uncanny sense that trouble was about to breach the door. He straightened the papers on the table, calmed his breathing, and braced himself. For him, the stakes were high, not just because of who sat inside the cabin that day, but because he knew every such moment carried echoes of the past. Each act of defiance, each flash of arrogance from those who underestimated him, reminded him of a truth he had been fighting all his life. Progress was never freely given. It was wrestled from the grip of resistance. Outside, the door handle rattled. Then came the sound of wood striking wood as the door flung open, crashing against the wall. Her presence filled the room instantly, sharp, intrusive, hostile. And in her mind, she was about to make a point that the entire neighborhood would hear about. What she did not realize was that this time, her intrusion would not end in whispers. It would end in silence, the kind of silence that comes when arrogance collides with reality. The moment the HOA enforcer stormed into the cabin, the air shifted. Her voice, sharp and commanding, began to rise. But then it faltered. For the first time in all her crusades, she was not the most powerful presence in the room. Her eyes froze on the sight before her. The state governor, seated at the head of the table, papers spread out before him, mid-discussion with senior officials. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus did not move, nor did he need to. The weight of the governor's presence was enough to hold the room. The enforcer's face drained of color, her lips parted as though searching for words that had suddenly abandoned her. Her carefully constructed authority, the imagined power she had wielded over the community for years, cracked in that instant. The governor looked up slowly, his expression calm but cutting. Without a word, his eyes asked the question Marcus had lived with for years. Why? Why here? Why now? It was a question that needed no answer, for the truth was written in every action she had ever taken against him. Her intrusion wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about control, about reminding someone she viewed as less than that they could never truly belong. But in this moment, she no longer held the upper hand. Her attempt to humiliate had backfired in the most public way possible. The officials, once strangers to her, now looked upon her with quiet judgment, their silence louder than any words. The irony was inescapable. She had come to assert her dominance, but instead, she stood exposed, her prejudice laid bare before the highest authority in the state. The room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus remained steady, dignified, his calmness a sharp contrast to her unraveling composure. The power dynamics had shifted forever, and for once, she was the one who no longer belonged. The governor's presence had stripped away the final layer of illusion. What the HOA enforcer had tried to disguise as protecting standards now stood naked for what it was, an act of prejudice, a desperate attempt to cling to control in a space she never wanted to share. She mumbled an excuse, her voice barely audible, before retreating toward the door. The sound of it closing behind her was not just the end of an interruption, it was the end of her power. Inside the cabin, the governor gave Marcus a nod, one that carried weight beyond politics. It was acknowledgement, respect, and a quiet statement that he saw exactly what had unfolded. The officials, too, understood. They had not only witnessed a man hosting a vital meeting on the shores of his own property, they had also seen the daily reality of resistance faced by people who dared to succeed in spaces not built for them. For Marcus, this was never about winning against one woman. It was about the message carried forward. Racism rarely shouts in the open. It hides in rules, policies, and self-appointed gatekeepers who believe they are protecting something greater. But when the mask slips, when the prejudice becomes undeniable, it exposes a truth that can no longer be ignored. The lake cabin would never be the same again. It had become more than a retreat, more than an office. It was now a symbol, a reminder that dignity and perseverance can stand firm even against hostility. The story would spread, not as gossip, but as testimony to the quiet battles fought every day in communities across America. And so, the question lingers for anyone who hears it. How many times must dignity be challenged before respect becomes the standard, not the exception? Because in the end, the measure of a community is not in the beauty of its homes or the size of its lake. It is in the fairness of its people and the courage to confront injustice when it stands uninvited in the doorway.